So everybody sees the assignment for next time, right? So we're doing Frederick Douglass, learning to read next time. And he's going to have a very, very different view of what education can do, particularly like the relationship between education and freedom than we get from Seneca. But I think that that's one thing that we need to think about a lot today is how Seneca connects the idea of education to the idea of freedom, right? What's appropriate for a free person. So what did you guys think of this? Let's just start there. How did Seneca go for you? What did you think of Seneca?
I like using.
Okay. What was confusing about him?
I don't know, like he's just different from everybody else. He's kind of like, I think of him as like eccentric.
Okay.
Because at the end he's kind of like, nothing really matters.
Okay.
Like, and like we know nothing, everything we know is like a lie, and I was like, okay.
Okay, and I think like he's actually being critical of that viewpoint, right? The idea that we can't possibly know anything. He's, like, well, if we can't know anything, then what the hell is the point of anything, right? So yeah, we'll get to that in a minute. You said you liked it, Serena. Why did you like this?
I liked it because he questioned everything. Like
Okay.
as far as like, why do we need math? Why do we need this? And I really thought like,
Yeah.
what do you think he would think about this class?
I think that Seneca's primary concern is with a particular definition of usefulness, right? What he is primarily concerned with is whether or not the educational curriculum you follow gives you a foundation for building virtues upon, right? So his purpose is, I think, ultimately a moral purpose. And he argues that the liberal arts in general don't make you virtuous. They don't help you to become virtuous, but that it's harder to become virtuous if you don't have that educational foundation, right? If we go to page 14, right? Someone will ask me how I can say that liberal studies are of no help towards morality when I've just been saying that there's no attaining morality without them. My answer would be this: there's no attaining morality without food either, but there's no connection between morality and food. The fact that a ship can't begin to exist without the timbers of which it's built doesn't mean that the timbers are of help to it. There's no reason for you to assume that X being without something, being something without which Y could never have come about, Y came about as a result of the assistance of X. And indeed, it can actually be argued that the attainment of wisdom is perfectly possible without the liberal studies. Although moral values are things which have to be learnt, they are not learned through these studies. So, what would he think of a class like this? I think how do I want to phrase this? So, his biggest problem is with studies that lead towards the acquisition of money, right? His biggest complaint is about studies, the primary goal of which is greed or avarice, right? And at the very least, we can probably say that this class isn't really about the pursuit of cash, right? Nothing that you learn here is necessarily going to make you any richer. And I don't think he would have a problem with this class because we are talking a lot about the idea of, building virtue and, education is a process to make you into a better person. But I think, yeah, he would say, well, okay, but knowing this material doesn't necessarily make you a better person, right? It might help you on that journey. It builds, it might not even help you, right? It's necessary foundation for that journey, right? We might actually even compare that to Sun Tzu, right? Think about what Sun Tzu said about the difference between thought and study, right? Thought, you're just sitting there spinning your wheels by yourself, right? Study is thinking with the assistance of some kind of foundation. So you've got books, you've got scrolls, you've got papers, whatever that you're learning from. He's got that analogy about, standing on tiptoe. Versus standing on a mountain, right?
Did you say that like thought is what you already know, but like study is like expanding on what you know?
Yeah, thought is like standing on tiptoe in that you're relying only on your own capacities, right? You're relying only on what nature has already given you, right? So if I'm standing on tiptoe, then yeah, like I could still see further than if I was just right here, right? But I could see even further if I climbed up on this desk. Right? If I used something outside of myself as an aid to vision, right?
I kind of felt branching off from this
Mm-hmm.
was in 1:16. Essentially, we had fallen victims to ourselves. And
Okay.
like our ways of what we had learned thus far.
Uh-huh.
For where he talked the second paragraph, yet look at the amount of useless and superfluous matter to be found in the philosophers.
Uh-huh.
And then he goes on after that, but just we sit and we think only kind of about what we've received thus far, and we don't seek more, I guess, in a way.
Okay. Well, and I think when he complains about superfluous knowledge, right? What he's talking about is basically shit that you know that doesn't really help you, right? Things that you know that are not useful to you in any way, right? And again, we have to distinguish here that useful to him means that which helps build moral virtue and wisdom, right? He has no use, as he says, for studies that help with the making of money, right? Would usually be termed useful, right? So it might help if we go back and we talk again a little bit about context here. The basic assumptions that Seneca is writing from. So Seneca was a follower of a school of Greco-Roman philosophy called Stoicism. Have any of you ever heard of Stoicism before?
I think it came up in our whole study class.
Okay. It probably did. Do you know what it means to be stoic, if you're behaving stoically?
Reserved.
Yeah.
Void of emotion.
Yeah, we tend to associate stoic, the word stoic, with somebody who never shows emotion, right? Like Mr. Spock from Star Trek or something, right? It's not really what Stoicism is about, but their approach to emotion does kind of influence that portrayal, right? Or that misconception. So what a Stoic believes is that human beings must learn to live in harmony with nature. Right, that is, that we need to learn to live according to the cycles of the natural world, right? Now, what this ends up meaning in practice is that we must learn to accept that which we cannot change. Right, so one of the areas of useless knowledge that he talks about, right, is astrology, right? Knowing about the movements of the planets, right? It's like, okay, so how does knowing that Mercury is in retrograde and is going to do all these, supposedly going to do all these wacky things to me, how does knowing that help me if those things are going to happen anyway, right? What I need to know is not what happens when Mercury is in retrograde, but how to live in a world in which these kinds of things happen, right? So, the best use of human reason is learning patience in the face of difficulty. And I think this is where that notion of emotional reserve comes in, right? That, you know, if a storm comes and floods your village, right? There's nothing wrong with taking precautions against that storm, right? Against, there's nothing wrong with seeking shelter on higher ground, right? There's nothing wrong with, moving your family and your livestock to a safe location. Maybe even trying to seal up your house. But a Stoic would argue that it's pointless to cry over the damage left behind by the storm, because there's nothing you could have done to stop that. Right? You can't stop a storm from destroying what's in its path, right? It's going to do what it's going to do. And so the best thing for you to do is to learn how to be happy anyway, right? Or at least how to be satisfied, how to be content, right?
I think that people are like, you learn from your mistakes and like you do better in the future. Kind of. Like if they were saying like, okay, the storm knocked down my house, but the next time I rebuild my house, it's gonna be like better and maybe like withhold like up to the storm. Like,
I think that it would be more accurate to say that they would say that there would be no point in crying about a house that was going to get wiped away by a storm anyway, right? Whether or not you took those necessary precautions, right? The point is to learn to be happy in the face of disaster, right? To be content with what you still have. So
You could be dead, right? So-
yeah.
And that can be
You
looked
could.
at as optimistically in its own fashion too, because then you don't have to worry about the miss.
Fair enough. But then if we look on page 13, right, I think this is where he really kind of explains this principle. Right? The geometrician teaches me how to work out the size of my estates, rather than how to work out how much a man needs in order to have enough. He teaches me to calculate, putting my fingers into the service of avarice, instead of teaching me that there is no point whatsoever in that sort of computation, and that a person is none the happier for having properties which tire accountants out, or to put it another way, how superfluous a man's possessions are when he would be a picture of misery if you forced him to start counting up single-handed how much he possessed. What use is it to me to be able to divide a piece of land into equal areas if I'm unable to divide it with a brother? What use is the ability to measure out a portion of an acre with an accuracy extending even to the bits which elude the measuring rod if I'm upset when some high-handed neighbor encroaches slightly on my property? The geometrician teaches me how I may avoid losing any fraction of my estates. But what I really want to learn is how to lose the lot and still keep smiling. So what he's arguing here is that the geometrician who teaches him about things like land area and square mileage and all that kind of fun shit, right, isn't really teaching him anything useful, because all he's teaching him to do is how to make more money or keep the money he has, right? Well, how then are you going to feel if you lose the estates, you lose all that money. Did this actually help you feel any better about yourself or your existence? And the point that he's trying to make here is that having this stuff is often more of a burden than it is a privilege. Now, one could argue that this is a burden borne by the privilege, right? Seneca was himself pretty damn rich. And it's easy enough for him to talk about wanting to lose his estates and still be happy, right? But I think his basic point is that it's not stuff that makes us happy. And that acquiring more stuff or maximizing the value of the stuff we have is not really the focus of a purposeful life, right? It doesn't help us build virtue, and it doesn't help us build good relations with our neighbors. It doesn't help us live in harmony with nature, because we want more from nature than what we actually need, right? So the point of Stoic philosophy is to learn to live with the minimum necessary for survival and still be content with that, right? Still be happy. So for Seneca, what amounts to useful information is that which helps you build that kind of equanimity, right? Yeah, go ahead.
I can't remember the name. I want to say it was like Marlowe's hierarchy of needs.
Maslow, Abraham
Maslow.
Maslow's hierarchy of needs,
And
yeah.
it kind of goes into that you can have everything else, but if you don't satisfy those emotional and friend needs and just
Sure.
peers, then you end up becoming depressed, or you don't
Mhm.
live a life of fulfillment, and
Yeah.
you tired of what you do have as your basic needs.
And it's funny, I think that Seneca actually would probably think of human needs in a very similar kind of way as that kind of pyramid, right? So, when we talked a minute ago about what use are the liberal arts, right? He talks about, you can't have morality without them, but you also can't have morality without food, right? Because you can't survive without food. Right? While the liberal arts may not be as important to survival as food, they are still an important building block to moral virtue because they do at least train you to use reason, to use your mind, right? And then, I think we would put what he terms wisdom or virtue above that then, right? So it is the same kind of level of steps building on each other, right? Now, as he said, the relationship is not necessarily direct, right? There's no direct relationship between wisdom and food, except that it would be stupid not to eat. Your body is hungry, right? But that you need to fulfill this level before you build these other levels, right?
It's not enough to, we've kind of gone over it before in the other chapters. It's not enough to say that you've done it. You still have to continue it. Okay, great.
Yeah.
I did this, now I need to move on to that.
I think you would agree with the Confucians on that, with Sun Tzu and Mencius both, who argue that virtue and wisdom are lifelong practices, and that if you stop, then you lose it. But let's look at how Seneca exactly defines the liberal arts. And I think the argument he makes about them is not necessarily the one that one would expect, right? So let's look at the very first paragraph. I'm going to get a volunteer to read this first paragraph from "You want to know my attitude towards liberal studies." Anybody? Go ahead, you made eye contact.
You looked like you wanted to.
I
Yep.
looked up and then you're like,
Yep. Uh-huh. Well, if nobody's going to volunteer.
Okay, I'll go, but she read last time, so.
I mean, I don't mind doing it. You want to know my attitude towards liberal studies? Well, I have no respect for any study whatsoever if its end is the making of money. Such studies are to me unworthy ones. They involve the putting out of the skills to hire and are only of value insofar that they may develop the mind without occupying it for long. Time should be spent on them only so long as one's mental abilities are not up to dealing with higher things. They are our apprenticeship, not a real word. Why liberal studies are so called is obvious. It is because they are the ones considered worthy of a free man. But there is really only one liberal study that deserves the name, because it makes a person free, and that is the pursuit of wisdom. Its high ideals, its steadfastness, and spirit make all the other studies puerile
Puerile, childish.
and honey in comparison. Do you really think that there is anything to be said for the others when you find among the people who profess to teach them quite the most reprehensible and worthless characters you could have as teachers? All right to have studied that sort of thing once, but not to be studying them now.
Okay, thank you. So, what can we gather about how he defines liberal studies from this paragraph? And that's like one of the things that we have to, one of the difficulties of this piece is that a lot of the terms he uses, we have to infer what he means by things from a lot of different parts of the essay, right?
I think maybe he's saying like you shouldn't pursue these arts just because you want to get paid. Like you should pursue it because you want like to know and have freedom.
Yeah, so if it's involved with making money, he does not count it in what we call liberal studies, right? Go ahead.
A sense of maturity comes with it.
Okay. Or at the very least with the pursuit of wisdom, right?
If he throws in, I guess, kind of going back to finding patterns, reprehensible and worthless.
Okay.
He kind of says that in a couple of different ways.
Yeah.
It's just a negative idea attached to what, it's kind of a pursuit of anything other than growth and involvement to better yourself and
Yeah, I mean,
be good for others.
For someone who is so concerned with equanimity and balance, right, he does seem to think of certain things in very black and white kind of binary terms, right? That, things are either essential or worthless, right?
What does he
Things are either
mean?
virtuous or reprehensible. Yeah, go ahead, sorry.
What does he mean by the last sentence? All right to have studied that sort of thing once, but not to be studied now.
I think that what he is, that's sort of part of what we're talking about here, that's sort of like the practice of the liberal arts as, or the study of the liberal arts as kind of practice for the study of higher things, right?
Does that play a part with when he said something later on about a kid in elementary or something? I can't remember. If I could
Yeah, I think just before the paragraph we looked at before, right? He talks about, where the hell is it? Now I know what you're talking about, but I can't find it now either.
Page 14, first paragraph, in which boys are given their elementary schooling. Is that?
Oh, yeah, there we go. Right, why then do we give our sons a liberal education? Not because it can make them morally good, but because it prepares the mind for the acquisition of moral values. Just as that grounding in grammar, as they called it in the old days, in which boys are given their elementary schooling, does not teach them the liberal arts, but prepares the ground for the knowledge of them in due course. So when it comes to character, the liberal arts open the way to it rather than carry the personality all the way there. So yeah, it's this idea of kind of learning things by elements, right? And then once you've got the prereq, you can move on to the advanced course, but you don't need to go back and relearn the prereq, right? So, if you say you pass Comp 2, right, you don't need to come back and take this class again. Now, I would argue that some of what you learn in a class like this, if you don't practice it, will fall out of gear. Like I can say from experience, there are a lot of things that I learned in high school and college that I've just never had any reason to use that, I don't remember how to do a geometric proof anymore. I don't remember most of the German I learned because I never had any reason to practice it or use it, right? But I think, what he is saying is that once you have studied the basics of something, you don't have to go back to it, right? It's then a process of building on.
Is it kind of like, well, they say like you can't force somebody to do that, like you can't force somebody to want to like study the liberal arts, because like if they're just in it for money, doesn't that kind of mean like they're not getting the full experience of the liberal arts?
Yeah, I think that's implied here. Yeah, that I think that Seneca would regard such a person with contempt. Perhaps more so than Sun Tzu or Mencius would. But yeah, I think he would probably agree that you can't make somebody pursue wisdom, right? That if you're forcing them to do it,
Because I feel like then it would just be, like I'm all about the money and not like trying to actually learn about the art.
yeah. Well, and even the things that would fall under the rubric of liberal studies or liberal arts here, right? And remember, liberal here means, right, those that are worthy of a free person. Right, so things that would be part of Hannah Arendt's Vita Contemplativa, right? Right, the arts that are worthy of a person who doesn't have to work, right? He's not talking there about things that will necessarily make you money, right? So it might help if we clarify exactly what is meant here by liberal studies. Like when we talk about the liberal arts, what subjects do you think fall under that rubric? What do you think the liberal arts are?
I'm thinking like humanity.
Okay, humanities subjects. Okay, so English, history, right?
Does political science fall under there anywhere?
Yeah, generally.
Okay, art appreciation?
Okay, yeah, art.
Theater?
Yep, art, theater, music.
Liberal and being kind of free, liberally applied. It kind of can cover a vast array of subjects.
Yeah, it can. Yeah. So, like, what kinds of subjects do we usually find in a liberal arts college?
Women's studies.
Okay. Which is usually like interdisciplinary. Let's think a little more traditionally, though, right? Like
Okay.
So these are all things you could major in at a traditional liberal arts college, right?
I think of Shakespeare instantly, just when I hear liberal arts. That's
Okay.
so.
But yeah, that's
anything that.
yeah. You would study that in an English class typically, right? The sciences would also fall under this category, as would mathematics.
I wanted to say astrology, but.
Maybe astronomy. At least today, right?
Comes from my own personal.
Yeah.
Like y'all just create a course for me.
You will not typically find an astrology course in any reputable university these days.
Would physiology, sociology, psychology, those?
Yeah, sociology, psychology. Now, some of these didn't exist as fields of study in Seneca's day. But certainly, things like literary studies, history, art, music, math, right? These would all have been part of a liberal curriculum. But we can also see that, at least for him, the division between liberal and useful isn't necessarily clear, right? When he talks about the geometrician showing him how to make money, right? Mathematics is usually considered a liberal arts discipline, and would have been in Seneca's time as well. But he's there grouping it with the useful arts, right? With the vocational studies, basically.
Would astronomy have been in his time frame? I'm trying to get an idea.
Yeah, I mean, astronomy would have been very much caught up with astrology, because the way people had of looking at the world was different, right? So the basic assumption in Seneca's time was that the Earth was at the center of the universe, and that the sun and the moon were planets.
Okay, so that's where I was trying to get that timeline, so I can get an idea of his.
Yeah, so yeah, we're looking at what we would call a pre-Copernican model of the universe, right?
There we go, okay.
It's Copernicus who demonstrated that the Earth actually moves around the sun rather than
So that
the other
hasn't
way
even
around.
started yet.
No.
And that Pluto is sadly not a planet anymore.
Well, in Seneca's day, people wouldn't have even been aware of Pluto's existence. It's not visible to the naked eye, and so wasn't discovered till the 1930s because it's so far out. They didn't have powerful enough telescopes to see it.
Was Galileo the first one to use the telescope?
No, telescopes have existed longer, but what Galileo did with a telescope, he discovered the moons, not all the moons of Jupiter, but several of them. Right? He saw that, okay, here's this bright spot in the sky that is the planet Jupiter, and hey, there are these smaller spots that seem to be orbiting it. Well, that's interesting.
So would he still have because with the study of that, it kind of changed their way of thinking, so.
Yeah, Galileo would be one of those people who instituted what would be called a paradigm shift among historians of science.
Would Seneca, kind of in his ideas of wisdom, would it have been more, I know we say philosophical, but would it have been a more religious base?
I would say probably not. This is based more like the Romans typically were not an especially religious people. They were publicly religious. It was expected that you would make at least Roman elites like Seneca. Among the common people, there was like a kind of folk religion where people had household altars to little household gods and things like that. But Seneca would have been probably expected as an important, wealthy person in Roman society to make public sacrifices to the gods and things like that. But yeah, most elites privately were not particularly religious, which is one of the reasons why Roman religion was so changeable and malleable. It was in a lot of ways a form of politics rather than a belief system. And again, this applies to elite religion, not folk religion. But
The reason I asked, before class we were talking about how a lot of the religions have a punishment kind of, or a reward at the end in their belief system. I don't know where I really read that he, kind of how Buddha talked about, there was negative effects of it.
sure, right. So
He puts a negative aspect, but there's no punishment that I see.
No, and that actually is a kind of specifically Greco-Roman thing, particularly if we look at ancient Mediterranean religions, and this I think is actually relevant to the thought process here, right? They're very this worldly rather than next worldly. There is an afterlife, but it sucks for everybody, right? So if you look, I don't know, how much do any of you guys know about Greek and Roman mythology? Okay, so basically everybody gets the same afterlife, right? There's an underworld inside the earth, right?
It's kind of like, I kind of think of it as like a limbo almost.
Yeah, it's not unlike the Catholic concept of limbo, where you're not punished, but you're not rewarded. Well, now, purgatory is a specific theological idea. So purgatory is where your sins are kind of like, you are actually punished in purgatory, but it's comparatively mild. And the idea is to burn off your little minor sins so that you can then enter heaven, right? So there's an end point. Limbo is for people who were not baptized. And it's another part of Catholic theology. The basic idea is that, you're not punished, but you're not rewarded either, right? So you're not made to suffer because it's regarded as not being your fault that you can't achieve salvation. But you can't go anywhere from there, and you're always aware that you're missing out on something. The Greek and Roman underworld would be much more like that, right? Everybody gets the same treatment. Nobody's special down there. Most of the shades don't even remember their past lives. So most Greek and Roman philosophy is very much focused on how to live in this world, because this world is the only one that matters. You were in the midst of asking a question a moment ago.
Okay. So where does language kind of come into play? Like the study of language, language. Would that be kind of liberal?
Yeah, language, linguistics, yeah. So I mean, we would probably file that under that usually ends up in English departments, but classics would be where Seneca's own language in a modern university would be taught. So when Seneca talks about literature and language, he's talking about Greek and Latin.
Because I kind of saw that was not like a theme, but it was kind of in there, like what he talked about.
Yeah. He does talk a lot about language, right? Like that, partly as a metaphor, right? Of grammar as a building block. And also, as the first of the liberal studies that he mentions in the second paragraph here, right? Can I get somebody to read this for us? The question has sometimes been posed.
Are we still on the same page?
Still page 12. Yep.
The question has sometimes been posed whether these liberal studies make a man a better person, but in fact they do not aspire to any knowledge of how to do this, let alone claim to do it. Literary scholarship concerns itself with research into language or history if a rather broader field is preferred, or extending its range to the very limit, poetry. Which of these paves the way to virtue? Attentiveness of words, analysis of syllables, accounts of myths, laying down the principles of
Prosody. Prosody, yeah. So the essentially like the method of writing poetry.
Okay. What is there in all this that dispels fear, roots out desire, or reigns in passion? Or let us take a look at music, at geometry. Sorry, I'm getting a blur. You will not find anything in them which tells us not to be afraid of this or desire that. And if anyone lacks this kind of knowledge, all his other knowledge is valueless to him. The question is whether or not that sort of scholar is teaching virtue. For if he is not, he will not even be imparting it incidentally. If he is teaching it, he is a philosopher. If you really want to know how far these persons are from the position of being moral teachers, observe the absence of connection between all the things they study. If they were teaching one and the same thing, a connection would be evident.
Okay. So what? So he breaks down a couple of these fields of study into their elements, right? And what's he looking for in these fields of study? What is he looking for and not finding?
Virtue.
Yeah, broadly speaking, right? But we can also kind of infer from this some of what he's talking about when he talks about virtue, right? So he talks about like all of these things you learn to do when you're doing literary studies, right? What is there in all this that dispels fear, roots out desire, or reins in passion? So when he talks about virtue here, right, when he talks about wisdom, what he's talking about here is, again, like learning to control your emotions, right? Right? Same thing in the next paragraph when he's talking about a musical scholar, right? Turning to the musical scholar, I say this: you teach me how bass and treble harmonize, or how strings producing different notes can give rise to concord. I would rather you brought about some harmony in my mind and got my thoughts into tune. You show me which are the plaintive keys, right? That is, which are the sad keys, right? I would rather you showed me how to avoid uttering plaintive notes when things go against me in life, right? So, like, yeah, don't teach me which keys play the sad music, right? Instead, teach me how to stop whining when things don't go my way. So all of this is about emotional control, right?
So self-control and insight.
Yeah, self-control in part through self-examination, yeah. So this is pretty similar in a lot of ways to the Confucian viewpoint, right? But does Seneca seem to think you get there the same way that, say, Sun Tzu thinks you get there? What does Sun Tzu encourage you to do?
Get a teacher.
Get a teacher, yeah. And study, right?
I don't know. He mentions like he just there teach me this, but he also talks about learning it on your own through your actions. At some point, I think it was page 14, but kind of contemplation. So it was a little bit of both. I can't remember where it was, where we were discussing how it was through the contemplative for Arnett.
That Seneca is talking about the kinds of arts that are involved in the contemplative life, right? The life of the mind, yeah.
So I think it's a bit of both. In a sense.
Yeah, I mean, you have to have studied before you can acquire virtue, right? But studying itself doesn't actually make you any more virtuous, right? You were going to say something a second ago, Serenity. What?
I was because you asked, what did you ask? You said something about him and son.
So right, yeah, whether
And
they
I
think
said-
you get to virtue through the same process, yeah.
I think it depends.
Uh-huh.
Because even Seneca, he was saying, what is a learned person?
Yeah.
So I think it depends, like, you have to discern who's actually giving you a connection between morality and virtue and wisdom and stuff like that, rather than, I don't know.
Yeah, and when he talks about connection, one of the things he's pointing out is that these subjects aren't even obviously connected to each other, right? Or at least the way they're taught. Like, they're not obviously connected to each other, so how can you be claiming to teach me the same thing, right? How can you be claiming to teach me a single body of knowledge? So the only body of knowledge that he regards as really worth pursuing or studying is philosophy or the pursuit of wisdom. But you can't get there unless you know this other shit first, right? And it's, yeah, I think that it's funny because Sun Tzu seems to be arguing that if you get a teacher and consistently study, you'll be okay, right? You can work your way from pettiness to becoming a gentleman, right? But Seneca seems to think that there's something else involved here, right? That you can't just get a teacher and study.
I kind of get the like feeling of you can study all you want, but like until you put like what you learned in action, and like you never get to where you want to be. It's kind of like it's not like a mental process, but it's more like a physical. Like you have to take what you learn and apply it to certain things. I would choose.
But part of what he's saying is that a lot of these things that you're learning in liberal studies don't really apply to the pursuit of wisdom, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Is he saying to let shit go? Essentially? Like,
That's-
worldly possessions, let it go.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and bad memories, let it go. Pretty much just Elsa that stuff.
Yeah, I think
Reference, but
I think that's a lot of, yes, to not let your emotional life center around the acquisition of knowledge as a kind of possession, right? Now, he does say that it is better to have superfluous knowledge than to have no knowledge, right? Let's look and see what we can get from that. So if you look on page 16, I have been speaking about liberal studies. Yet look at the amount of useless and superfluous matter to be found in the philosopher. Actually, let's actually go something a little bit earlier. Okay, page 15, top of the page. There is nothing small or cramped about wisdom. It is something calling for a lot of room to move. There are questions to be answered concerning physical as well as human matters, questions about the past and about the future, questions about things eternal and things ephemeral, questions about time itself. On this one subject of time, just look how many questions there are. To start with, does it have an existence of its own? Next, does anything exist prior to time independently of it? Did it begin with the universe, or did it exist even before then on the grounds that there was something in existence before the universe? There are countless questions about the soul alone, where it comes from, what its nature is, when it begins to exist, and how long it is in existence. Whether it passes from one place to another, moving house, so to speak, or on transfer to successful living creatures, taking on a different form with each, or is no more than once in service and is then released to roam the universe, whether it is a corporeal substance or not. What it will do when it ceases to act through us, how it will employ its freedom once it has escaped its cage here, whether it will forget its past and become conscious of its real nature from the actual moment of its parting from the body and departure for its new home on high. Whatever the field of physical or moral sciences you deal with, you will be given no rest by the mass of things to be learned or investigated, and to enable matters of this range and scale to find unrestricted hospitality in our minds, everything superfluous must be turned out. Virtue will not bring herself to enter the limited space we offer her. Something of great size requires plenty of room. Let everything else be evicted, and your heart completely opened to her. So what's wrong with collecting a lot of pointless trivia, superfluous knowledge? Yeah, go ahead.
you kind of give life to what you focus on. So if it's something that doesn't really matter, it takes up the space. If
Mhm.
you're breathing life into it, holding on to it, where you could be moving on and
Mhm.
bringing in stuff that is of actual value.
Yeah, you could be thinking about these much bigger questions about life, the universe, and everything, right? But instead, if your head is full of superfluous knowledge, then you're focused on all this piddly shit that doesn't actually help you answer the big questions, right? But it's a nice thing, surely, to be familiar with a lot of subjects. Well, in that case, let us retain just as much of them as we need. Would you consider a person open to criticism for putting superfluous objects on the same level as totally useful ones? By arranging on display in his house a whole array of costly articles, but not for cluttering himself up with a lot of superfluous furniture in the way of learning? To want to know more than is sufficient is a form of intemperance. Apart from which, this kind of obsession with the liberal arts turns people into pedantic, irritating, tactless, self-satisfied bores, not learning what they need simply because they spend their time learning things they will never need. Ouch. I feel a little bit called out here.
So basically what they're teaching us is useless information and we don't need it.
Seneca would argue that some of this would be true, yes.
He would argue that.
Yes.
It's like some of the stuff that we learned in high school, I'm like, when am I ever going to need this again? Like,
Mhm.
I really know how to change a
Sure.
tire, or like balance a checkbook, or I don't know,
Mhm.
something useful.
Yeah, well, and the thing is, too, like, Seneca would also regard that stuff with contempt, right? Because that's focused on getting on in the day-to-day world. What he wants you thinking about is the bigger questions, like I said, about life, the universe, and everything, right? About the nature of time and the nature of the soul and, that sort of thing, right? And you don't have the mental space to be focused on that if you're focused on, like, running down different musical keys, or if you're worried about how to change a tire, or if you are trying to divide up your estates geometrically, things like that, right?
It's like, let's be honest, we're never going to use geometry again. Why do we need to know it?
No, well,
I do.
Unless you're going to math.
yeah, well, if you go into certain professions, like, a surveyor, for example, uses geometry constantly, right? An architect uses geometry all the time. A builder even needs to know something about geometry. So, geometry is not equally useful to all people, but it's also not useless, right? But I think, again, like, Seneca is focused on a slightly different problem here, or what he sees as a problem, whether it is or not, right? That I think one of the key takeaways here, right, is that one of the things he's most concerned about is excess, right? Is about having more than you need. And a big part of his argument about the pursuit of wisdom, right, even when we talk about emotion, right, is about avoiding those excesses, right? It's okay to feel things, right? But if you're feeling excessive emotions and you're letting them get in the way of your judgment, of your reason, then it becomes problematic. If you're letting either your scholarly pursuits or your day-to-day financial interests get in the way of the pursuit of wisdom, then you are also behaving in an excessive fashion, right? That what you need to be trying to do is figuring out how to cut more out of your life, right? Cut the fat out of your life in order to be happy. Does this make sense? All right, do you guys have any further questions about this? I think we've been through more or less the whole essay here in various parts. And I like that we didn't just kind of go through it from first paragraph to last. I like that you were pointing us into different places and different directions. So,
I guess their outlook is kind of like the Buddha's, like, in order to really understand the liberal arts, you have to cut out the stuff that you don't need. And it's kind of like the same thing with, like, enlightenment.
yeah, I would argue that the Buddha probably doesn't think you really need to study this stuff at all anyway, right? That the Buddha would argue that all you really need is to learn self-denial, right? Whereas Seneca would argue that learning this stuff actually helps you with a building block, right? You've got a foundational level for then the pursuit of wisdom.
So would theology be a liberal art?
Theology is traditionally grouped with the liberal arts, yeah. We can stick that up here.
So, it's basically the whole saying ignorance breeds ignorance kind of thing. If you stay ignorant to certain subjects, allowing yourself to be stagnant, then it's just going to continue that cycle for you with others.
I don't know how much Seneca's worried about cycles. Or even, like, you know, and he does argue that having some knowledge is better than having no knowledge. So ignorance is bad, right? Ignorance is bad regardless. Because if you are ignorant, then you don't have the capacity to ponder those big questions.
I've noticed he didn't have a huge regard to other people. Like, it's mentioned a few times, but it's more about your own betterment. Even still, there's kind of a touch of selfish nature.
Yeah, I would say the Stoics aren't necessarily misanthropes. They don't hate people. But I think that, yeah, the philosophy is based very much on being strong in yourself and on kind of building up your internal reserves against external realities, right?
What if it's like false knowledge, if that makes sense?
I think that pretty much any philosopher would say that false knowledge is bad. But then again, like, you know, what constitutes false knowledge in any given historical period is determined also by context, right? So we just talked about, for that pre-Copernican worldview, right, that you know, we now know that the sun does not revolve around the earth, it's the other way around. But remember, Seneca also says that knowing that doesn't really matter, right? Because it doesn't, you can't do anything about it. It doesn't change anything. You know, you can't arrest the planets in their cycles, so why worry about it?
I mean, that's all valuable points.
Yeah.
So basically what he's saying is to get rid of the materialistic things, the unusefulness, whatever, knowledge, and pursue something that will feed our soul, like mentally, emotionally, and that will help us become human beings so that we can learn to live in harmony with nature.
Basically, yeah. Yeah, I think you got it. And that living in harmony with nature is, again, like just being able to accept whatever nature throws at you. Without having a hissy fit. All right, anything else, guys? All right, good job today.